Yeah, to be frank, like when I wasn't doing that well, I remember I was failing tests and all that stuff, So when I wasn't doing that well, I was telling my dad, hey, if this continues, if I continue to fail, can I go back to Taiwan? And he said, no, there's no plan B. If you're going to wash dishes, you're washing it here. So to be very frank, there's no path backwards, right? And when there's only one path forward, and the tiger or the shark is like chasing behind you, you run. You run really, really fast.
All right, welcome everyone to another episode of the Jake Dunlap Show. We are very excited that you joined us. If you haven't tuned in, this is the show where we talk to celebrities, thought, and industry leaders to really discover their journey to success. I am super excited that you're joining us. This show is like no other. I can promise you that. You might laugh, you might cry, but you will definitely leave inspired and gain a whole new level of insight into those people that you follow, love, and admire. All right, welcome everyone to another episode of the Jake Dunlap Show. I have a very unique guest today, and I am super excited. This individual, a lot of people have been in tech and they go from this company to this company. This person has really experienced all the ups and downs. He has pioneered various technologies from literally nothing to over $78 million. It's been 15 years since he started his company in his parents' basement, and his site now serves 18 million unique monthly visitors. And it's just really a unique story that I think all of you are going to love. And what we're going to do for this guest is we're going to talk about how, the ups and downs of scaling a business. And we're going to talk about the past like we always do. But we're really going to talk about, how do you persevere? How do you stick through those times to really build a rocket ship? And so I'm very excited to have the founder and CEO of Spokeo, Harrison Tang. Harrison, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Jake, for having me as well.
Well, I'm looking forward to this. So we're going to go back in time a little bit, but because you have such a unique journey, we're going to focus on, I think, the three, and again, I think I'm going to do four with you. It was supposed to be the top three, but I think you need four because it's been 15 years and you've got it, nailed. Biggest learnings as you've scaled your company. But I do want to go back and give people some context and maybe talk a little bit about, what it was like for you, kind of growing up, what led you to start the company. And so from, you understand you're born in Taiwan and then moved here when you were 13. So what are some of kind of the early memories that you have about, growing up in Taiwan and then, the move to the States?
Yeah, I think the move to the States is actually the toughest thing. Like people ask me, which is tougher, getting to Stanford, starting a company, or coming to the United States. I would say moving to the United States is the toughest because I didn't go to English prep school. So I was, just a regular student. Actually, I was top of the class. And then basically one summer, my parents decided that we were moving here, and suddenly I dropped to the bottom of the class because I can't even understand what my teachers are saying. I remember some kids were laughing at me. I don't even know what they're laughing about. And, so that kind of challenge, kind of like dropping from the top of the class to the bottom of the class, I think that challenge is actually really, really tough, especially for a teenager who doesn't know better. So it was quite a bit of experience, but at the same time, looking back, that experience really prepared me for what's coming, right? Because once you've gone through that, everything else just seems a little bit easier.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially like you said, being at the top and then coming at that age in particular, which, is a tough age, for a lot of folks. And, it's what I read is that you'd learn English from basically copying the dictionary and reading Jane Austen books as well too, which are some good, easy ones to read then.
Actually, one of the things people don't realize, and I would recommend other English as a second language people to read Jane Austen, is because Jane Austen loves using hard vocabularies. So like some authors, they think using hard vocabularies is a cool thing to do. So when you're reading, like it takes like you a day or 2 days just to read 1 or 2 pages. Like you can't really tell what the storyline is, right? Because very few books have the entire storyline in 1 or 2 pages. So Jane Austen is good because one, she teaches you a lot of vocabularies, and second one, instead of a one big climax, Jane Austen's every single chapter has its own little story plot. So that's why I picked Jane Austen. And copying, it's not a fun read looking back, but it's definitely better than copying dictionaries, I would say.
Well, that's great. I think, again, and what do you feel like, for you gave you that drive to do that, right? I think maybe a lot of people at that age, could have taken a different path and just been like, well, I'm kind of a victim of circumstance, or I'm just going to kind of do the best I can. But what was it that led you to really kind of take that approach, or how did you think about that approach or learn that approach?
Yeah, to be frank, like when I wasn't doing that well, I remember I was failing tests and all that stuff, so I wasn't doing that well. I was telling my dad, hey, if this continues, if I continue to fail, can I go back to Taiwan? And he said, no, there's no plan B. If you're going to wash dishes, you're washing it here. So to be very frank, there's no path backwards, right? And when there's only one path forward, and the tiger or the shark is like, chasing behind you, you run, you run really, really fast. So, so that's what it is. So I'll just give a lot of credits to my parents, as opposed to myself, because I'm not one of those guys who would self-motivate myself to achieve higher. I'm just a regular folk, so my parents was really the driving force, telling me that there's no other option than forward, actually.
And then, and obviously, so then, you go into high school pretty soon after that, and you end up getting into, that's a pretty quick turnaround. It's almost like 14, 15 years to where you go from, not understanding any English to getting into Stanford. And so, again, as you started to progress, like, what were those later years of high school like? And, what was it like for you to get into Stanford, as you kind of like reflect back, looking over what you kind of accomplished in just a short period?
Yeah, it was a little bit tough. I'm not going to lie. I was studying pretty hard, so, so I was, at first I was copying dictionaries, and afterwards, I wasn't, I can start appreciating the storyline and things like that. And then I have always been kind of strong on math, so that part that wasn't that challenging. So I think it's just a continuation of hard work. Actually, I remember the day I received the letter of acceptance from Stanford. That day I remember very, very well because my mom literally cried, and she just literally speechless. So my mom actually, didn't have a full-time job. Her full-time job is just raising me and my sister. So she later told me that this is a huge validation of her work, because I couldn't really understand it at that time. And she's just so speechless. And I think, looking back, I think for me, that moment really is just more of a moment to honor my mom's hard work, as opposed to, myself, to be very frank, because when I got it, I was like, oh, okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Well, again, and I think sometimes you don't appreciate it right then in the moment, you get an inkling of it, and then you kind of are able to appreciate it.
Yep, definitely. Sometimes you don't really know what you get into, right? But
well, yeah, then you go to Stanford, and so you're like, all right, well, let's pick an easy school to get into here. And you did a double major, economics and electrical engineering. What do you remember again? And obviously you went on to get your MS as well, but what are the things you remember about undergrad at Stanford? You kind of have spent the first 5 years really, kind of getting up to speed and, doing what you needed to do and being pushed by your parents. And then, what are the things you remember about undergrad in particular?
So I got into Stanford, and then my first major is economics, because I didn't really know what I was going to do. So I asked my dad, like, hey, what major should I pick? And he said, not too hard, have a little bit, because I have always been a more studious kid. So he just doesn't want to push me that hard. So he said, hey, what about something like economics? So I picked that one. I just remember toward the end of the first year, I saw something called hologram. So it's basically a way to store 3D imaging, and I was quite intrigued because there's so many ways to basically create this concept of reality, right? But one of the hardest one is actually the physical reality. But if you can actually recreate physical reality, you really can reimagine what reality is for humankind. So I thought that's quite intriguing. And I look up the coursework about, hey, what do I need to study and understand in order to really understand how hologram works? And by the way, this is holographic imaging. It's not, I think the word hologram has been quite abused nowadays, actually, because a lot of what's called stereoscopic imaging call themselves hologram. But in reality, those things doesn't store imaging information in 3D. So I look up those things, and then I realized I either had to be an electrical engineering major or applied physics. And I thought at that time, if I pick applied physics, if things don't work out, because I have no idea what the end result or the outcome will be, I thought that if I pick applied physics and things don't work out, I'm not going to get a job. So I picked electrical engineering. So that's how I got double major. And I actually don't know exactly why I was an electrical engineering major until senior year, actually, when I started taking Fourier optics and realizing the relationship between optics, right, light, energy, and actually signal processing and electrical engineering. So that's how I end up with like two majors, double majoring between econ, economics, and electrical engineering. And then later on taking on masters. It's all because of this moment in the freshman year in which I experienced holographic imaging and really want to understand the meaning of physical reality. Yeah.
That's. I mean, do you remember what the image was? Do you remember what it was that you had seen?
Yeah. So it's a human face, and it looks like. Well, it doesn't look real because it's monochromatic. So it's one single color. But other than that, everything looks real. Like it has shadows. It just looks like something is in front of you, even though it's not there. And it's just like really, really amazing. I thought, hey, if I can make it color, then really I can recreate reality, right? Or playback reality. But then later I realized, it's not as easy as it sounds. There's a reason why it's a single color.
Right, exactly. So you stay, again, you graduate, you kind of stay in and continue to work on some pretty interesting projects and then go back to get your MS. What were those years? So after you graduate, you're kind of thinking about, okay, where am I going to take this? And you kind of stayed in and kind of continue to work on some, pretty big projects. And so, what made you want to go back and get your master's of science, and just really, really dive in here?
Actually, to study holographic imaging and optics, you actually have to get masters. So that decision actually wasn't that tough.
Yeah.
Obviously, I got an email or invitation to interview at Google, and then later Facebook and all that stuff. So that makes it
early days too, man. That stock back, if you think back, that stock would have been pretty interesting.
Yeah, but I was hell bent about really understand how this thing worked. So actually, doing masters wasn't that tough of a choice. I think it's after masters that's pretty tough because once you learn how it works, you realize all these challenges. For example, why is that thing look so real yet it's only single color? Obviously, everyone wants to make it multicolor. So what's the challenge there? And then also a lot of applications in optics is getting killed by silicon-based technologies, whether it's a holographic storage getting killed by magnetic storage and now solid state, right? And then one of the biggest applications in optics is actually CD-ROMs or cathode ray tube, and it's all getting killed by silicon-based technologies. And I remember the professor told me one of the lessons he learned in the past like 50, 60 years is don't ever bet against silicon. So I get a point. I realized that I either has to stay in academia or national labs or have to do something else. And that's actually after master's, after I learned all these things about optics and holographic imaging and things like that. So anyway, so the choice actually is harder after toward the graduation of my master years, whether to stay on this path or do something else. And I chose obviously the latter.
Yeah. And how did you, again, I'm guessing especially coming out of getting your master's, there's probably even more of this happening. But you decide to start your own company. It sounds like with a few roommates. And what was that, again, like you have these amazing opportunities. You've been in academia, like what gave you the, I guess, confidence to go straight from that? And again, I'm sure you could have had jobs at any of the companies you mentioned and more. Why start your own thing? Why was that kind of your calling?
So actually the decision wasn't that tough because when you were a student and you have no girlfriend, no kids, no strings attached, for lack of a better term, really you have nothing to lose, right? So the best time to do something crazy is actually that time, right? Because you have nothing to lose, no strings attached. So actually it wasn't that hard. And also my kind of background, because it's so specialized, I might get a job at Google or Facebook, but I might not. It's not a guarantee actually, because I wasn't studying computer science. I was doing, I was doing like Fourier transforms and double integrals, so I'm not sure Google need that kind of person, to be very frank. So, so I think the decision to start a company wasn't that tough because I am not sure I want to stay in academia forever, right? And I figure, hey, might as well try something new. And if it fails, I can always go back to my default path. So it wasn't that tough, actually.
Right. And then, and you started in your parents' basement. So is this you and Mike and Eric? Are you all in your parents' basement in the early days? And you kind of describe the early days as like 2006 to 2009 as the like product market fit years. And there's a lot of ups and downs. So is everyone in the basement just like tinkering away, trying to make it work?
More or less. I mean, different people join slightly different times, right? So there's some time lag here and there, but more or less, we all, at one point, we were all like working in my parents' basement, and when we kind of got stuck on some projects or had some downtime, we start playing video games. So
exactly.
So yeah, right. So more or less, we at one point we were all like at my parents' basement, just tinkering away. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of like Silicon Valley. Like your parents were oh gosh, I can't remember the guy's name. I'm going to blank on it. But you're there and then you take a break, you play some video games. And look, the first years are not easy, right? And I know again, going from like kind of what we talked about before, that 06 to 09, there's a point where you guys almost, and like a lot of you were young too, you guys had probably great degrees, like where you almost had to call it, quits or went bankrupt, where you had to, kind of go back to your parents to, again, kind of secure funds after the first few years to continue. And so how do you think about those first, 4 years and those kind of like those ups and downs and then the decision to kind of persevere? And like, what was your number one takeaway from like that product, you call it the product market fit years. What was like your big takeaway there?
Yeah. So I think the biggest takeaway, I'll just share a little story, is when I went to my dad and, I was telling him how bad of a son I am and kind of lose his initial round of funding because we need a little bit more. And he told me, son, it's okay because when I gave it to you, I already written it off. So that's the first thing he said. So essentially, he has zero confidence, right?
He's like, son, just so you know, I just liked having you around.
Yeah, that's when I realized, oh, okay, you did it just because I'm your son instead of you actually really believing what we did. But the second thing is the most important thing. The second thing is that he said, success is actually not about whether you gone to Stanford or Ivy League or how smart you are. It's actually whether you can last till the end, whether you can last longer than your competition. So at that point, so I know this sounds cliche, but at the end of the day, you need that kind of persistence, right? Because you are going to hit a lot of problems and challenges and hurdles along the way. And do you have that persistence? And I understand persistence and stubbornness, sometimes that line is quite blurred, but you do need that, right, in order to actually cross that finish line.
Yeah, and so you did. So, right, so you take on, you kind of go back to them, and then, you kind of describe, so kind of lesson one here for everyone of your kind of top four. Again, we usually do three, but we're going to do four of, kind of scaling is this, lasting to the end, persistence through those troughs, right? And I think that's where most people give up. And I see people do this even in their own roles as maybe, working for a company that, things happen, there's a trough. And I think anyone who can tell you who's been through the trough and come out the other side, those are the learnings that shape you. And if you never do that, if you never persevere past the point of stupidity, sometimes where most people would not, I think it's just a big learning that a lot of people today are missing out on, and I'm sure this is something you've probably, seen. And as you think now to the next phase, so 2010 to 2014, you called those the crazy growth phase. We talked before, it is like a little bit of, naive or blind growth early on, or just like, hey, this is what we're supposed to do. So what are some of the big takeaways you have from that period, that, 2010 to 2014 is, things are just all of a sudden take off, and, what was that like? And what are some of the things you look back and reflect on, from a learning standpoint?
Yeah. So I think, when things are going well, I think the key thing is you have to ask why. So that's the difference between growth and blind growth. And the same thing with trust and blind trust, right? So when you're growing, you really actually have to figure out, what is driving the growth. And I'll just give an example. I'm a big proponent of A/B test experimentation nowadays, right? So even if it's something that sounds very, very intuitive, if it's not too hard and not too cumbersome, and for us, for Spokeo today, it's usually not, because we have an A/B testing framework, a pretty mature one. So in those cases, I always ask for A/B testing experiment to validate and invalidate hypotheses, to quantify measurement and impact, right? So even though it sounds like intuitive, I still want to learn those things, because if it has a valid hypothesis, obviously sometimes people will test every single thing. I'm not a proponent of that. But if the hypothesis is valid, right, then I would test it and validate and invalidate it. So that's one of the things when I was talking about the difference between growth and blind growth. That's one of the things that we didn't do when we're in the blind growth phase, right? We were just like, oh, things are going well, users are coming in, money are rolling in. Let's not ask why, let's just keep doing what we do. And unfortunately, when you don't have the reasons, or you don't know why you're succeeding or why you're failing, it's very, very hard to replicate it or correct it in the failure case.
And is that what happened, through this crazy growth phase? It was just like, you weren't really sure what it was that was catapulting you, or, again, because, you described a little bit of that, like, blind growth. Was it, at what point did you guys realize, okay, we need to understand this, or it's important?
So at some point, I'll just give an example. We will be looking at metrics and numbers, and things just don't make sense. Like, you're like, hey, we're sacrificing user satisfaction for revenue, or certain things just don't make a lot of sense. And at that time, we were just like, oh, the numbers speak for itself, right? Don't trust the numbers, trust the data. Don't trust your human intuition. Well, unfortunately, later we found out a lot of the instrumentation, the data collection, is actually wrong. So this is actually one of the interview questions I ask all candidates. So I'll give a little tip at the interview interview tip. So one of the questions I always ask is, give me an example when you get a report or a KPI that just don't make sense, right? How do you kind of debug the issue? How do you identify the problem and debug the problem? The answer is, first of all, you have to check the data collection step, right? Well, first of all, you have to have a good hypothesis of why you think this thing has issues. And then you check the data collection, you cross-collaborate among different data sources, right? To see if all the different sources and different perspectives align and correlate. And then you look at whether the queries are wrong. If the data collection is right, maybe the query and the aggregate is actually incorrect, right? And then how do you actually visualize it and things like that. So more or less, that's the answer. And honestly, we didn't ask any of those questions, and the instrumentation was wrong. So we were just making decisions, right? We're just making decisions based on a spreadsheet. And I always tell people, if running a business is so easy, why do you need humans? Robots can do it, right? Data at the end of the day represents the voice of the people, okay? Data at some point comes from a person or a device or some kind of entity, right? So you really have to dig deep into what people are saying or what a device is trying to tell you or what an entity is trying to convey. And we didn't ask any of those questions. And I think that's the difference between growth versus blind growth, trust versus blind trust.
Wow. I mean, there's a lot there. And I think any entrepreneur, I was taking a note here about our own organization, as we've doubled this year in size as well, head count and everything. It's that concept of like that blind growth is also scary. And, I think it's an important lesson here for anyone listening, even if you're in a department that's growing or, an apartment that's not growing. Going in and again, using that kind of scientific method of really trying to understand where it's coming from, not trying to test every hypothesis, but hypotheses that are grounded in both gut and data, I think is a really important lesson, for a lot of people. And so then there becomes kind of this phase where up until this point, you aren't actually, kind of the CEO, you become the CEO, and then you move into the next phase, which is, you prescribed this phase 3, the 2015 to 2019, as the dig back into the why. So you'd been through this blind growth, and there's also kind of a story that you talked to me about kind of your first stab at CEO and then your second stab, which actually happened almost immediately. And so maybe talk to me about that transition. So you're going from this blind growth or blind trust to informed trust, informed growth, into this dig back into the why, and these kind of, you talked about like 6 core values and kind of grounding in that. So what was that transition like for you as you're becoming the CEO and you're really trying to kind of hone in on continuing to grow but being grounded in the why?
Yeah, so it's about really asking questions, right? And I'll just give another example between trust and blind trust, right? So the MBA books will talk about how you should trust and delegate to your direct reports, right? To your teammates. Trust them, right? Let them do and let them shine. Build a stage for people to shine. And by the way, I agree with all of that. Now, the only thing that I would add is that what if that team member's heart is not there? What if their strength and capabilities are not the ones that's needed to be successful in that role? How do you know, right? So what is the measurement that helps you assess whether this person is the right fit or not? Because I do agree that you should trust the person and that person to shine. But that said, if that person is the wrong one, then if you have the blind trust, then that's not going to end up with a good result. Mm-hmm. So how do you differentiate between trust and blind trust? The key thing is you have to have transparent data-driven management, right? So obviously the concept of managed by objectives, or one of the kinds is OKR, objective and key results. That's very, very important. Another one is you have to have very, very good metrics, right? So one of the things I learned during this phase, it started out as actually revamping our customer care team. So before, our customer care team doesn't have a lot of metrics. I think there was only 4 or 5. Okay. And then we have a new leader that joins, and then he started introducing this kind of concept, and then introduce like a 30 metrics model, grading different calls. We actually have a team, quality assurance team, that listening in on the calls and calibrate how we respond to customers. When we first introduced that, to be very frank, it was like a culture shock.
I can imagine.
Now, actually, a third of the team actually left within the 6 month. And I'll just be very frank. At some point in time, I was thinking maybe I support the wrong guy, you know.
Right, of course.
But I think I stick to him. And in retrospect, this is one of the best ideas, best decisions I've made. He introduced this concept, and all the metrics and performance are so transparent that people hold themselves accountable. Mm-hmm. So later I scaled it across all teams, scaled to customer care team, operations, talent acquisition, marketing, everything. Okay. We are to a point where I don't have to say anything. Like people will say, something went wrong here, right? Let me correct it. I didn't even say anything. People are just holding themselves accountable. And that's the difference between trust and blind trust. I think blind trust is one that you just say, but you don't do, right? If you really care about somebody, you spend time working with them to help align the objectives between you and that person. Blind trust is the case where you don't care enough to do that. And I think true trust is transparent, right? And when there's a problem, it's transparently conveyed. So that's one of the things I learned. And ultimately, to answer your question, it's about keep asking questions and increasing this transparency, right, across organizations.
Wow. I mean, I think hopefully anyone listening, I want you to go, I'm like, okay, minute 36. Like, I'm going to go back and re-listen to that too. That is one of the best definitions of trust I think I've ever heard. Because I think a lot of times we almost think of the way that you described it as almost maybe inverse, which is like blind trust is like not needing transparency and just blind. It's almost like I think maybe we can confuse blind faith and blind trust, right? Where it's like, I don't need like I just trust, you know, or I just give it to you. And I think the way that you framed it, at least for me, I think was a really valuable way for anybody listening. And so as you started to learn this, and so during those years, tell me about this kind of decision to focus back on the why. So as you go in, you become CEO, you're learning these things, you're learning the differences between, you know, blind growth, blind trust, and growth. You know, what were those years like, you know, 2015 to 2019? And then if you want to share the story about your first experience at CEO and your second experience, I think it's also would be pretty interesting for people to hear.
Yeah, so I think it's quite challenging, right? Because when you're trying to evolve and actually pivot the company, right, especially when it's almost 200 people strong, it's a lot harder to do that than when you only have 4 people, right? So you have to do a lot of alignment, a lot of communications, and the truth is some people just don't agree. And how do we actually do that? So it's quite challenging. I'll just share one lesson I've learned. I was the CEO at first, and then later on, one of my co-founders wanted to be a CEO. I said, okay, sure, you be the CEO. So he was CEO for about 5-6 years. And later on, there was some difference in opinion. I came back and things like that. But one of the things I learned is you have to, whether you have a difference of opinion or not, at the end of the day, you have to recognize what other people have done. So at Spokeo, we try not to use the word pivot, actually. We use the word evolve. And the difference between evolve and pivot is that even though both are about change, evolve respects the past, and pivot doesn't. Pivot just says, hey, the past doesn't mean anything, right? It's completely meaningless.
Yeah, I agree.
And the reason why it's important to talk about evolution as opposed to pivot is because to get someone who doesn't agree with you on your camp, it goes back to our very first of the 6 core values, which is you have to listen with empathy. The best way to get someone and convince someone, the first step I would say, to convince someone that's not in your camp that we're on the same boat is you have to acknowledge and listen to what they say. Because if you don't even do that, I can guarantee there will always be a chasm between the two. So when we're trying to evolve, right, the company from the second phase to the third phase, really trying to dig into asking the why, really trying to dig into this transparent data-driven management. I didn't go in and say, hey guys, what you guys did is wrong, and this is the new way, right? No, I definitely didn't do that, right? I introduced it one step at a time, and every step along the way, and I really mean it, by the way, I take the moment to recognize everyone's hard work, that they've done in the past, and acknowledge what they've done, because without them, we won't get here. So that's just one little lesson I've learned, is the importance of recognizing other people's work, right? Whether you agree with it or not, the importance of listening and acknowledgement, because that's the very first step of getting everyone on the same page.
I think that's something that everyone, can listen to. I think sometimes people are so convinced, like the path forward, and I can admit that I probably do this sometimes, where you like your vision is clear, and so sometimes you skip that extra step, and it feels like it's right, and instead of taking that extra step to have those conversations, you then get people that are committing to things they're not bought in on. And that's the worst thing. At least that's what I've seen in my company and other companies, is when you've got a group of people that are making changes or pivoting, but they're not bought in. And I think the lesson you shared is a big reason for it. It's that they don't feel heard. They don't feel like they really get it. And so they don't fully buy in. And so that's why, as a consulting firm, we'll come in on the back of a failed change initiative, and that's it, almost without fail. And so many lessons here. And as we kind of start to wrap up here, we've talked about the product market fit. We've talked about the crazy growth phase. We've talked about the digging back into the why and some of the big lessons. What's the big thing for you moving forward? What are the things that, again, you have said the reason, it's such a unique story where, unlike your typical founder, where it's, especially you're in Silicon Valley, you're building the company there. It's like you raise a boatload of money, you sell at some point, or you IPO, and you do all these things. And, you've been there for 15 years. And so what is it that keeps you excited? Like, what are you most excited for when you look forward, from 2021 into 2022?
Yeah, I think it goes back to kind of mission. And by the way, mission is defined as why you exist. And vision is defined as what you want to be in X time frame, right? And then strategy is how you're going to achieve the vision. So to answer your question, I think it goes back to the core, using Simon Sinek TED Talk around the difference between why, how, and what. It goes back to the core question of why, which is the mission. And our mission is to make the world around us more transparent. So the idea of transparency has 4 levels. On the surface, people think of transparency as just data and informational transparency. Hey, this is what I've done, or this number is X, the number is 10. This is great, right? But that's just really the beginning. The second phase is what we call contextual transparency. How do you know 10 is a big number or small? I mean, compared to 100 is small, but compared to 1 is 10 times bigger, right? So how do you have the context to really understand that piece of information? The third level is knowledge and intelligence transparency, which is the difference between knowledge, intelligence versus data is that knowledge is about leveraging data to make informed decisions. So how do you provide that transparency around decision making? And the fourth level, which is actually the most interesting to me and what drives me continuously today, is what's called epistemic transparency. So epistemology in philosophies is one of the four pillars in philosophy. So the four pillars are metaphysics, which is about being and what you are. And epistemology is about how do you know something is true or not. So it's a question of how. And then the third pillar is logic and ethics. So anyway, these are the four pillars, and Spokeo's mission is about providing that epistemic transparency, giving you the tools and technology to know what is true and what is not. And if you really think about it, this is a 1,000-year-old problem. I mean, there was a problem called ship of Theseus, which is talking about how does if a ship, all the constituents, all the log, all the components gets replaced over time, is it still the same ship? Right?
Yeah, I've heard it. Yeah, we talked about that one. That was I love that analogy. It's one of my favorite.
Yeah, so it's like a very, very interesting problems, right? And actually, this sounds philosophical, but let me bring it back to reality. So your entity, your digital entity, a person consists of hundreds of records. Now, if those records gets updated 100% of the time, how do we even know it's still the same person? Does this still have the same personal identifier or not? So it has these actually questions is not just very intriguing, but actually has tremendous impacts. And I think ultimately that's what drives me, because I do want to kind of better understand and solve these problems. Yeah.
Harrison, that's amazing, man. There are so many takeaways. I've been writing notes. I've been typing notes. There's so many, I think, for anyone who's scaling a business and anyone who's, even some of the things you're talking about now, who's trying to work on themselves. I think there's just a lot of, things that you've learned. And, I think we all know that how we learn these things sometimes is from retrospect versus having this beautiful foresight. Because it all looks like, genius, whenever you look back, right? You're like, oh yeah, this person must have seen this coming, or this thing happened. And the reality is, we make mistakes, we stumble, we go left, we should have went right. And then we kind of triangulate closer and closer to the right path. And so, Harrison, massive thank you for joining us today. I think everyone listening and watching this now is going to have a million takeaways. This is definitely one of those episodes that, I think people will go back and rewatch just to take, as many notes as maybe I did. So big thank you again for taking the time out and, joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Jake. And thank you for your kind words. Like all of us, we're all trying our best, right? And in my case, I'm just trying to do our best to figure out and solve problems, because ultimately that's what excites me. Solving problems, building Legos is what excites me. So I think all of us are just trying to do our best. So thank you for having me. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining us for another episode on the Jake Dunlap Show. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to another extremely fun and interesting episode. I thought it was fun and interesting, so I hope you did too, of the Jake Dunlap Show. Really great, just breaking down everything that makes people who they are, the success, the trials and errors, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite platform, and make sure, more than anything, to go over to jakedunlap.com. That's where you're going to stay up to date on all the latest guests, additional details, prep notes. We're going to be sharing everything on jakedunlap.com. So go ahead, go over there. You can subscribe there as well too, and we will see you next week on the Jake Dunlap Show.